And I want to talk to you a little bit about meaningful differentiation. Differentiation has been a plague over certainly over my career as a teacher. All sorts of horrible things done in the name of differentiation, and some of those I think drive down standards for some children and make things worse for them. And so, if we want meaningful differentiation, what would that look like? So, one of the things that I want to start by saying is that if we realign how we think and concentrate first on trying to meet the needs of our most needy, the children who have SEND of various different kinds, then if we do that and do that well, all children benefit. And I think that where this gets misunderstood and often goes wrong is that I've often heard, I think, teachers say things along the lines of, well, my approach to differentiation is just to teach really, really, really well, and the children with SEND, they benefit because I'm teaching so well and I've got such high standards. And that's almost the opposite, I think, of what's truly effective. It's concentrating first and foremost on children with SEND, working out what their barriers are to learning, trying to overcome those obstacles. And if we do that, then we're aligning our practice with how human beings learn best, not just children with various different forms of SEND. So that's the first thing to say. So I've already addressed that point. So that should be the priority. If the neediest, if the children for whom it might be most difficult to have high standards are front and center, everyone is likely to achieve. So as a point of consideration, how can we aspire to have the highest standards for those children, the children that keep us up at night, the ones where we think, I'm not sure how we can do it with them. And that's obviously a big ask. So one of the things, and we'll talk more in a little bit more detail about how these play out in the various different areas that we've on our list of things to look at. One of the areas is about scaffolding. And the point of scaffolding is that it ought to be, in my view, to enable somebody to do something that they currently cannot do. And I think far too often it's used to make easy things easier or achievable things more achievable. And I think that if that's the underlying motivation, then it's likely or certainly possible that it ends up being potentially a problem. But if we put in structure, scaffolding, support in order to get children to do things that they can't do without our help, then it's not only important, it's necessary, it's crucial, it's obvious that we need to do that. But then we need to have a plan for taking it away, for getting rid of it. Otherwise, children will become dependent on it. And if they're dependent on something that we've provided, clearly they're not independent. And if they're not independent, ultimately, they're less likely both to achieve well academically and to be able to live happy, fulfilled lives post-school. So there has to be a plan for getting rid of our structure and support, and that's easier said than done. So the principle here about putting students with the greatest needs first is to make sure everybody has the support they need for as long as they need it in order to be successful, but then acknowledging and communicating that nobody has actually mastered something until they can do it independently. And so a useful rule of thumb here is don't get students to practice until they get it right, practice until they can no longer get it wrong. And if that's your guiding principle, then good things are likely to follow. I'm just going to, and this is going to have a bearing on what we do later, but I'm just going to give you a really brief primer of the basics of cognitive load theory, which I'm sure you've heard of and know something about at least, because it's quite trendy at the moment. But I think hopefully this will be useful and important and valuable for covering the things and making sense of the things that we go on to talk about. So a cognitive load is produced whenever we undertake some kind of task or process. The more challenging the task, the greater the cognitive load. So if we do something, we're trying to multiply two long digits in our head, that's got a high cognitive load. If we're trying to reverse park an articulated lorry, high cognitive load, potentially, unless you've done it a lot. And obviously, if you're getting dressed in the morning, probably quite low cognitive load. So the two areas that make up the load we experience when engaged in a task is the demand of the task itself and whatever help or support or structure that is to help us cope with it. So we can think about task demand in two different ways. And the first way to think about it is in terms of the inherent difficulty of the task, its quality. And we are intuitively pretty good at thinking about this as teachers. We know that the most sensible thing to do when getting students to undertake some kind of process or task is that we give them an easier version first, and then build up to a slightly harder version, and eventually move on to the most difficult that we need them to contend with. And that's a good intuition. That's obviously sensible and generally a good thing to do. Where we're less intuitively successful, I think, is this other area of task demand, which is the quantity of a task which we expect students to contend with. And I think typically we ask students to do too much too soon. The longer they're engaged in the task, the more likely they are to become cognitively overloaded. And you can see this in all sorts of ways. You know, if you're asking students to do a page of sums, you know, the first few are more care and attention is taken. They just become tired as time goes on. You can see it in writing. The first paragraph might be quite crisply written, and then quality deteriorates. One problem with this, there are two problems I think that we need to address. One problem is that asking students to do too much means that inevitably many of our students end up doing things badly. And if you practice anything, you get better at what you practice. So if you get better, for instance, at writing badly, you get better at writing badly. Now, clearly that's in nobody's interest. It's quite counterintuitive, but you don't get better at writing by writing badly. That's just never going to happen. You need to have practice at writing really well. So the other big problem is that we ask students to do something that they look at and think that's a bit beyond me, that's too much. And instead of them strategizing and thinking about how they can accomplish a task, they think I just can't do it. It's beyond me. I'm rubbish at English. I'm rubbish at writing. I can't do French, maths, whatever it is. I'm just going to give up and not try. And that happens far too often. I'm sure you've all seen that play out with students in your schools. So doing something about that seems really, really important. So one of the ideas that we're going to be talking a little bit as we go today is about less for longer, particularly as it concerns writing. So that's the top part, the task demand. The other part that affects the load we experience when engaged in a task is the resources we have available. At the beginning, these are external resources, and if we're getting students to do things they can't currently do, clearly we need to help them. So all the help we give them is an external resource, and that's our teaching, the questions we ask, the feedback we give, all of that is an external resource, as well as physical resources that we produce and put on desks and put on classroom walls and all that kind of stuff. Now they're essential, but as we said earlier about scaffolding, it's also essential to have a plan for getting rid of them, because what we want and what we have as relative experts, as teachers, is we have the internal resources. We have internalized those structure and scaffolding and support, often to the point of automaticity, and so we can be independent. Now, if external resources are too readily available, then there is no incentive to internalize. So unless we start taking away, dismantling the scaffolding, will leave students high and dry and make them dependent on those resources, or in a position where they go, I can't do it, when they're suddenly taken away, for instance, in an exam situation. So that's the basics. That's that basic model: cognitive loads and equation, task demand divided by available resources. And I want to suggest this to you, that a really good way of thinking about our efforts in whatever we want to achieve, but particularly in leading literacy, is that success must precede struggle. Students must experience success before we ask them to struggle. If we ask them to struggle without having experienced success, then they are unlikely to persist. Why would they? So success first is vital. So thinking about what this looks like in lessons, it's a bit like SatNav. SatNav is a really, really effective way of navigating and finding directions to wherever you want to go. It's the perfect feedback machine. For instance, a SatNav, it knows exactly where you are in your learning. It gives you you tell it your goal, you tell it what you want to achieve, and it gives you step-by-step directions and very precise feedback about progress until you arrive at your destination. It's so good, it's so effective, that we experience success, and we think perhaps we're better at navigating than we are. And teaching needs to look like this at first in order to get students to experience success. If they don't experience success, they don't persist. So we need something like that: explicit instruction, worked examples, all of these sorts of things which help our students experience success. But then as they master those basic procedures with scaffolding and support, we then it becomes not only possible but important to remove some of that scaffolding. And at this point, maybe teaching should be a little bit more like navigating with an A to Z. And speaking personally, I'm not very good at map reading. I'm the sort of person, if I'm driving with an A to Z, I have to stop the car every now and again and rotate the map to align with the road layout. And I can use it, but it's much, much more effortful. And because it's more effortful, I'm more incentivized to learn the route. So the problem with SatNav is it's so good, there's very little incentive to learn how to do it independently. I'll just keep on using it. But the map reading is that much more difficult, so it's probably easier and more effective and efficient to be independent. And so this is what teaching needs to, at some point, and this obviously depends on the children in front of us, at some point this is the process that we and our students need to undergo in classrooms, that they need to gradually experiencing a ramping up of challenge, knowing that we never want them to fail and give up, but ultimately we want them to be independent. And if they leave us, anything that when they leave us, anything that isn't in their long-term memory, anything they can't remember happening, anything they're not aware of, we might as well not have bothered. They only leave with what's in the contents of their minds and memories. So if our teaching isn't aligned to that eventuality, then we are asking for them to be dependent and less effective learners and less academically successful, and all of that stuff which we're trying desperately to avoid. So as a basic primer, that's the slightly abstract way of talking about the fact that we need to have high standards for all our students, even those that we think are the ones that are most likely to keep us up at night. Work hard to work out what it is we need to do to make them experience high levels of success, provide the scaffolding and the structure to ensure they are successful, and then slowly, gradually, bit by bit, take that away so that they automatize procedures and principles and become increasingly independent. Easy to say, hard to do.